Hey guys, thank you for coming. Good afternoon. My name is Pedram. Welcome to Austin if you guys are not from town. I love this conference. I hope it stays here. I happen to live just a few blocks away from here, so it's great for me. I hope they keep it in this spot. Quick background for me, and I'm going to talk pretty fast. This talk should be like an hour plus long. I gave it last at Black Hat. This is research that I was doing last year in 2018, or 2019 rather. Just some quick background. You have an offensive background mostly. I started my career in the 90s, just kind of for profit phone phreaking and cracking software just so I can get access to it because, I was poor at the time. Nobody was paying me to do computer hacking. I went to iDefense, started the Vulnerability Contributor program there. Later on, came down here to Austin to start the Zero Day Initiative. Did a startup in like post-AV compromise called JumpShot that went off to Avast. And in recent history, I've been working on Inquest.net. This is a tool for detecting exactly these kinds of samples that we're talking about. So this is a research point that I find fascinating and something that I'm doing on a regular basis. So what is worm charming? I have to give credit to my dear friend and colleague Rob King for coming up with this. This is a real-world East Texas sport. Believe it or not, folks get together competitively, and what they're essentially trying to do is get earthworms to come up from the ground. They're doing this through some kind of percussion, either by like tapping on the floor or playing some kind of musical instrument. And I found it as a good... yeah, this is real. None of these are staged photos. These are a legitimate Eastern Texas sport. I have yet to actually have the privilege of seeing one in person. Perhaps someday I'll be able to quelch that itch. But in our terms, what we're looking for is there's a lot of beautiful exploits out there. Like, you'll look at the ZDI, for example. They'll publish these like multiple chained Chrome escaping exploits, escaping sandboxes. You look at some of the cell phone exploits. They're jumping from chip to chip. But in actuality, in reality, the vast majority of compromises are one of twofold. Either somebody left their S3 bucket wide open and all your personal information went out the door, or somebody opened an email attachment, either activating a malicious macro or maybe some client-side exploit, and this is how the initial compromise was made into your network. So, what kind of lures we want is the question. Where do we find these lures? How do we dissect them? And then more importantly, or most importantly, is which ones are interesting, right? Like, how do we get the interesting ones to come to the top? Because malware sample-wise, there's just a ton of things out there. So in terms of the kinds of lures that we're interested in, the previous talk was more about post-compromise, right? Once you've gotten some exploit chain going off, or somebody has just gone in and clicked on a macro to open it, once you've actually gotten persistence, then you can deal with the C2 side, the command and control side, the pervasiveness, the persistence, the backdooring. I'm more interested in how does that get there in the first place? And so commonly for us, if you look at like the Verizon reports, over 90% of attacks are delivered over web or email, and generally it's through some kind of file-based attack, right? Like typical carriers like PDFs, your Office suites, Java, Flash, scripts and archives, these kinds of things. From an offensive perspective, this is the last place where vulnerabilities are going to die, right? With your compiler protections, your OS hardening, it's hard to write an exploit these days. But in these worlds, you've got programmatic access to scripting, so you can massage memory. You've got mixed media. You've got a complex attack surface. You've got an attack surface that's constantly changing. Like PDFs can render 3D objects. That's not an easy task to do. That's an easy place potentially for an attacker to find a parsing issue and find some kind of vulnerable code. The other thing about these kinds of attacks is that it's trivial to encapsulate them within one another. So you'll see my Russian nesting doll here, the Matryoshka doll. Put an exploit in a Word document and put it on the wire, and you'll see some people detect it. Bury that 3 layers deep, and suddenly it's bypassing your entire, at least network detection stack. But you will find the user who's going to go through the process of decrypting a password-protected zip file, clicking on multiple layers of dialogues and actually executing that final payload. Funny enough, 20 years ago, it was beneficial to have a non-interaction exploit. Now interactivity is good, because if you even look at, for example, the cuckoo process, if it requires some interactivity, perhaps even requiring the user to go click on a specific pixel inside the document to unravel the next stage, and I've seen malware samples like this, You've got a document within a document, a gigantic arrow that points at like this minimized little thing to click on to activate the next layer. The system, it's hard for it to do that. There are sandboxes that will randomly click around. There's some things you can do, but the point stands, right? Interactivity is going to hurt your detonation tools, and encapsulation is going to hurt your static analysis tools. There's tons and tons of examples of this. We've already covered some of them. You've got some that have CVEs. You've got some that are things like phishing lures. And then you've got some freebies. DDE here is Microsoft Dynamic Data Exchange. It's a vulnerability that came out, I forget exactly when, it's a little bit older now, maybe end of 2018 or maybe earlier in 2018. And it was so trivial to exploit, I could show a room full of people how to do it in like 5 minutes, right? It was a very basic, essentially just a command execution vulnerability that was just present in every single version of the Office suite. And it very quickly became an attacker favorite. All right, so now that we've defined what we're looking for, well, where do we go to dig to find these samples? And there's a variety of things you can do, right? You've got open detonation chambers like hybrid analysis and any run. Anyone can sign up for an account on these systems and pull down samples and do searches. They're awesome tools. You can look at Twitter, RSS feeds. People are talking about either IOCs or samples that they've found. Sometimes they have links to open directories that contain these payloads and these pivots. And so you can harvest IOCs from Twitter and RSS. You can feed them to a crawler, and you can start ingesting fresh malware from the wild. You can map attacker infrastructure. Right? On the most basic version of this is if the same email address is used to register 2 different domain names, they're both malicious. The third domain name this guy registers is probably going to be malicious. If you're monitoring that through a tool like Domain Tools, that is something you can throw into your crawlers. There's more advanced pivots you can make. You can look at things like Google Analytics IDs. You can look at SSL IDs. You can look at a DNS server's IPs. A myriad of pivoting you can do to map attacker infrastructure and then be alerted when new infrastructure is stood up. If you're working for a large company, you have your enterprise email spool. There's bound to be a myriad of pre-filter attacks that are coming at your gates at all times. And then if you're a commercial vendor like we are, you probably have access to VirusTotal's intelligence service. And this is what we're going to dive into, is harvesting lures from VTI. So let's look at the numbers. What are we talking about in terms of possible corpus? So this is very recent stats from VirusTotal. They're pretty consistent, a little bit of a bump in recent history, but for the most part, if you look at the files uploaded, this is daily to VirusTotal, about 1.6 million files a day are uploaded. About 1.4 million of them are distinct files. About 1.1 million of those are new, and about 800,000 of those are malicious. So on the bottom right, we're looking at a tally of about 1.6 million files total that are being uploaded to the service every day. So that's too much for us to look at, either manually or automatically. It's just a large number. The expenses for sandboxing and detonating that kind of sample pool to try and find the more interesting ones is astronomical. Well, if we look at the file distribution, we already have a much smaller problem to deal with because we're looking for PDFs, Office, Java, Excel, Flash, these kinds of things, and that drops it down to 500,000 right there. So a third of them we've cut off. Now, one of the benefits of VTI is that you can write YARA rules, collections of strings and regular expression patterns, along with some additional condition primitives, like new file means that this is the first time it was uploaded to VirusTotal. And all these, the slides are open. I'll put them in the ACOT channel. All these rules are already up on GitHub. I'll stuff them over there, so don't worry about writing any of these things down. So what we're looking for here is, let's look for any Office document, regardless of whether or not anyone thinks it's malicious, if it has a macro. We care about it. That's about 1,000 a day. Let's grab all the Office documents that has either an ActiveX object embedded or someone thinks it's malicious. It has at least one positive note. That's another 500 a day. We're up to 1.5K. I'm going to kind of fly through these to save time. We're going to find Java files that might be malicious. Now we're up to 2,000 files. We're going to find RTF files that have some potential maliciousness to them. PDF documents that have JavaScript. Whether it's good or bad, I don't care. If it's got JavaScript, I want to pull it out. And anytime there's a flash embedded in a document. Very rare is the day that you're going to see this being used legitimately, although I have seen folks use RTF files as kind of like a zip container. Like they'll open up an RTF file and they'll drag 20 files into it and they'll email that thing out to a friend. Why, I don't know. I guess that's just what they were taught. So, bottom line is with some intelligent filtering, we can drop the daily consume count from 1.5 million to about 2,500 samples a day. Still not something that we can do manually, but this is a far more manageable problem. It's about 1% of the corpus. So now that we've gotten our daily catch, for lack of a better term, how do we dig deeper into this thing? Well, we could do sandbox detonation, feed all 2,500 of these through a sandbox and get some more information that way. We can do some IOC extraction, whether it's through the detonation chamber or whether it's through static analysis. We can take those IOCs and do hunt pivot crawling. We're going to dive into what we can do with static analysis, since it will scale a lot faster and quicker. We might not just be ingesting from VirusTotal. We want to be able to support a larger volume of files coming in. So there's a lot of open source tools out there to help you out. Really, it's just some plumbing that you have to do to piece these things together, these tools of the trade. Some of them are being maintained by our colleagues and are constantly being updated to be responsive to the most modern-day threats. You look, for example, a more recent sneakiness when it comes to Office macros is hiding the actual macro itself through P-code stomping, right? The byte code is still there, but the actual symbolic code is gone. Well, these things have the capability of dissecting those tools. For Java, CFR is my favorite tool. That's why it's got the champion trophy there. JAD Retro is a good tool for normalizing your Java files to be of a specific version that CFR can handle. Right. On the Flash side, you've got things like FLASM, SwiftDump. These are all going to be doing things like either extracting the action script from your Flash file, which is like JavaScript lookalike, or actually just decompiling the bytecode of the Flash as well. You might be able to find some value there. For PDF, we've got tools like PeepDF, PDF-ID, etc. For Office, you've got Didier Stevens' great tools. Decalage does some great work here as well. A lot of combination of many great tools. Overall, what we're trying to do is extract embedded logic, metadata, and potentially semantic information. What was written in the actual document, what's in the cells of the spreadsheet. So what we set up, piecing some of these things together, some of our own proprietary stuff. We're ingesting from VirusTotal. It pulls in, it grabs the file, it puts some sparse data into a scalable Aurora database. This is all Amazon-based. We'll actually run it through our scanning technology to explode it. We run it through some YAR signatures to find interesting things. And this is kind of neat. On the right-hand side, what we're doing here is, recall that we had that new file marker for every single file that we're pulling down. Well, so those are the AV verdicts the initial time it was seen. The AV industry is an echo chamber. If there's a false positive, it'll echo, and then people figure it out, and it'll settle. If there's a false negative, information's exchanged, and within a couple weeks, you'll see that everybody suddenly has a detection for a sample. So what we're doing here is we're saying once we've received the file, at plus 10 days and at plus 20 days, we want to do rescans, and we want to re-grab those verdicts. And so you're watching the consensus across the entire antivirus industry settle. Right, by the 3-week mark, and the longer you do this, the better it is. If I do it at 6 months, at a year, it's going to have a better a settling rate. But this is sufficient for getting quick. We've played with these numbers. Is it 1 week? Is it 2 weeks? 10 and 20 days seems to be the best bang for the buck in terms of getting answers fast. On the other side, we're also ingesting from Twitter using something called Threat Ingester. That's free and open source, something that we put on our GitHub. ThreatKB is a YAR management tool, also free and open source. But you don't have to deal with any of these things, because what we've done is, and this is accessible now, we made labs.inquest.net, which is taking that entire previous slide worth of data flow and putting it into a tool that's just publicly and openly available. You can request an API key if you want to do more than 1,337 requests in a 24-hour period. And you can do everything that you can do through point and click, you can do API accessible. So we have a large corpus of malware samples. It's growing every day. There's about 700,000 in there today. And these are all limited to Office documents. At some point, we'll open the gates on PDFs and other swaths of malware sources as well. We do reputation aggregation across a number of sources. We do IOC aggregation through that threat ingester tool. So if you're interested in this kind of work, it's an easy way for you to just immediately start kicking the tires without having to stand up any infrastructure. So now that we have, we've pulled down samples, we've done some dissection. How do we find the interesting ones? What are the good vibrations for figuring out which samples we want to spend our time focusing on? By the way, I learned this later on. What that bird is doing is also worm charming. By stomping his feet on the ground, he's like replicating the feeling of rain dropping, and the worms come up and he eats them. It's pretty awesome behavior. So some things you can look for, right? And these are all ways, if I were a malware author, I would never do any of these things because you want to essentially hide in the norm. If you do anything to try and break your dissection or detection or to slow down an analyst from looking at your code, you're going to make your stuff stand out in some way, shape, or form. So as an example, MIME evasions. The typical MIME header is RTF1. But that's not required. The Microsoft parser is notorious for being super flexible. There was a tiny PE challenge posed once, and I think it was Alberto Angentini. I always butcher this guy's name, but he made this super tiny PE file that you would never expect is a legitimate portable executable file. It has like self-referencing, like backwards referencing pointers, and it works. It's incredible. The Microsoft parser will load that thing into memory and execute that PE. Any PE parser is going to be some steps shy of what Microsoft's parsing is capable of. So RTF1, not a requirement. You can get away with just RT. But what legitimate RTF generating program is doing that? I don't know of any. So by doing this, you might break your MIME detection for some companies, but you're totally standing out. Another example is the PDF marker. That does not have to be anchored at 0. Most folks don't know this or pay attention to it. If you look at most Yara signatures, they anchor this %PDF at 0. It could be anywhere. It could be floating in the first 1K, and if you have the right extension, Adobe PDF will open that up and render it without a problem. So it's a common tactic for bypassing or evading detection, but it stands out like a sore thumb, at least to me. You can burn 0 days via your symbols, right? Now that we have access to macros from documents, JavaScript from PDF, ActionScript from Flash, if they put stupid terms in there like shellcode, exploit, ROP gadget, heap spray, that's great. I want to know about all those things. You've got something called the UTF-8 byte order marker. Age-old technology. Any file can be prefixed with this 3-byte prefix, and it changes the byte order. So again, if I could put this in front of a zip file, I might break somebody's zip file detection and just bypass the detection stack. But again, this kind of stands out. Chaff is something you can do generically, and we dive into that a little bit. This is actually looking at that DDE exploit I was talking about earlier. You can see the DDE auto. In this highlighted, I have a regex in there looking for essentially XML or HTML, whatever tags. You can see that it's referencing MS Word, it's doing a directory traversal, going up to command, and it's using regsvr to pull down a DLL from some remote, in this case, Six Flags - Fright Fest. This happened to be around the time of Halloween. The malware lore was essentially saying that we have free tickets for the company-wide tickets for Six Flags. And it was a legit, this was a legit campaign. This is how they tried to mask the DDE auto injection. If that was one string, perhaps your signature or your ML or whatever might have found it. But they injected all this chaff in between. It does nothing in terms of affecting the exploit, but in terms of affecting the detection, that's suddenly a pain in the ass because you've got all this junk, this chaff that's in between. And you just kind of see going through all the different pieces. Then there's ones that come out all the time, like new ones. In February of 2018, there was a technique published by Kaspersky. RTF, the parser, is written as like this finite state machine, and they figured out a way of giving it a byte sequence that would result in that finite state machine just eating. I call this a byte nibble tactic. Right? So it's similar to that previous slide. Actually, we have it right here. You can see this is with the chaff in it, and that's it cleaned up. And you can see the regex I'm using. But this sequence of just a single character, backwhack, quote, and then 2 characters, all 5 of those are just going to be removed when the RTF parser looks at it. So if you're familiar with, this is an RTF document that has an OLE object embedded into it. You can see that 0105 at the very start here after the obj data. It's buried in here. So again, it's going to break detections. So by looking for this chaff, things stand out, and potentially you can burn ODE. In fact, so in February, this technique is published by Kaspersky researchers. In April, a 0-day comes out in the wild, and it actually leverages this very technique. So if you were on top of it, you saw this new thing. That's cool. Let me see what kind of samples are being uploaded to VirusTotal that are leveraging this byte nibble, 2 months later, you would have struck gold because someone was using a 0-day, and before the campaign launched, they were testing it against VirusTotal, and there goes their wares. So some other real-world examples, all right? And these are, again, I did this research in 2019. I tried to update it for this talk. 2019 was like the year of the browser 0-day. We did not see one 0-day in the wild that was through these types of malware lures. But let's take a look at these guys. So 2018 4878. This sample was initially uploaded to VirusTotal in January 22 from South Korea, and 2 vendors heuristically detected it as malicious. This was a flash 0-day. I think in the end, this was a digital rights management O-day. It was attributed to North Korea. A fairly good OPSEC actually too. What they would do is they would first pop the machine, ensure that they could run Flash, and then they would download their Flash 0-day. That way they weren't just sending their 0-day out to any single person. Then on 2.1, there's a public cry on Twitter about 0-day that's being exploited in the wild. Again, if you're ingesting from Twitter, so for example, we've written this threat ingester that looks for the word 0-day, the word open directory. You can put in search terms and just start eating automatically what other folks are talking about. Later on, we see some more uploads from various U.S. sources, and the detection jumps to 9 vendors. By 2.5, 20 vendors have proper detection for this sample. So starting from 1.22 to 2.5, if you're able to implement these kinds of systems and stay on top of the malware volume, you have the potential to find a gem, a 0-day gem in the rough. Now, 0-day is not the only thing you're looking for. Those are really going to be outliers. Most times what we're looking for is just interesting lures that are bypassing detections. They're not going to contain 0-day. They're just going to contain some new obfuscation scheme or some new combination of things that are going to bypass detections. So we want to stay on top of those things. Which worm charming vibrations did this thing leverage? It was an RTF that embedded SWF, and that SWF had debugger detection. So here's the tweet. Here's the detections over time, and you can see why we do the rescans when we're ingesting data, right? From day 1 to day 10, there's a huge jump. We know that this thing is more than likely it's malicious. There's AV consensus going on. Here's an example Yara signature. Once you've actually pulled ActionScript out of Flash, or macros out of Word, or PDF out of JavaScript, you have this debugger check. It's saying if there's a debugger attached to me, return. Not every single piece of code that does a debugger check is malware, but it's interesting. It's one of the heuristics that will float this thing up to the top. Right? Debugger checking is also used for a DRM, for example. Many Flash games might have it built in. Here's another example, 2017-8759. Again, this was 0-day that was burned on VirusTotal before it was used in the wild. So on 8.24 was the first upload to VT. No detection. Nobody saw this thing as malicious. From 8.24 through 9.12, you had 11 additional uploads and 11 additional scans. Still nothing. So now this malware sample is making the rounds, but still hasn't been detected by folks. 9.12, the 0-day campaign is discovered in the wild by FireEye, and they publish a report on it. By the end of the day, you've got 2 vendors that have detection. By the end of the next day, 30 people have detection for this thing. How could we have found it if we're looking at this VirusTotal feed? Worm charming vibration-wise, there's evasive magic. So this had an incomplete RTF file, and it had chaff around the embedding of the OLE. Previously, we saw chaff with that byte nibble technique. In this case, the chaff was much simpler. It was just a bunch of new lines, right? It doesn't matter if you can have arbitrary new lines in RTF. So they just took that 0105, which most people are going to try and anchor on, and they just broke it up with new lines. And here it is. You can see on VirusTotal, there's more vendors, and there's like 70 vendors. I just could only fit this much at the top of the screen. And again, from 8.24 to 9.12, no detections being found. So, I've shown you guys labs. There's a lot more to this. I'll post the full video to the talk for anybody who's interested, but I wanted to take some time to open up for questions. Yes? Oh, interesting. Very good question. His question was, when you're doing the rescan, are you just rescanning the original file by the original hash, or are you modifying the hash by changing some byte? We don't do that, actually. And that's a very smart idea. The concept there, of course, being, what if someone's caching the result, right? Like, you want to force them to rescan the file. Interesting. Yeah, very interesting. So, again, to the comment, and I know these guys are from Walmart because during that previous meet and greet, he was saying that what they're doing is they are actually modifying the hashes because they find that a lot of these AV vendors are hash-based. I will say we weigh the AV vendors. So there's there's like 70 AV vendors. More than half of them, we have them at a 0. For the ones that are remaining, we've got variable weights for them that we tune based off of how we feel about how good they are. And then we've got filters on the names as well. So I know, for example, that Microsoft is really good at finding keygens, and keygens typically look malicious because guys code them in unique ways. So heuristically, they look bad. So that's one of the things I'll have like an offset. If Microsoft says it's a keygen, probably is a keygen. The heuristical signatures other people are firing doesn't really mean much. So it's a great point. Somebody else had a question? Yes. Interesting. To recap, I believe he's complaining about the fact that if we do that, it's going to waste resources for folks having to rescan different things. You can use the SSDeep, right? The two things should have very, very similar SSD hashes, very similar sizes. So there's other ways of clustering those things together. But any other questions? Yes. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Predominantly, so the question was, are we using VTI just for the file feed, or are we using it for other API as well? Predominantly, it's the file feed, and the ability to do ongoing active hunts with Yara and retro hunts with Yara as well. But predominantly, it's as a great source of files. All right. Oh. Would you mind throwing the data flow slide back up? Sure. I mean, I'll just put the whole. You can have it in full, copy-pastable resolution. All right. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.